Immediately claiming central space opens avenues for swift development and potential pawn thrusts. Establishing immediate central contention, this Sicilian defense choice injects asymmetrical struggles and sharp tactical possibilities right from the outset. Instantly staking a claim in the center and preparing d4, this knight jump dictates the fight's initial direction. Embracing a closed structure now, preparing to challenge the center and potentially lock down the kingside. Opening the center aggressively establishes immediate central pawn presence and seeks to unbalance black's pawn structure. Releasing central tension opens lines and invites a dynamic fight for the d-file, challenging white's initiative. Capturing the pawn instantly opens the knight's diagonal, aiming for central control and creating immediate pressure on black's underdeveloped kingside. Developing the knight to its natural square, nc6, now contests the center and prepares to castle, a sensible step in this open Sicilian. Solidifying central control, this knight aims to bolster the pawn structure and potentially launch a kingside attack. Securing the b5 square with the pawn advance prepares for future queenside expansion, a common theme in this Sicilian. Exchanging the knight here fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening the c-file for potential pressure and giving black the bishop pair, a significant long-term advantage if the center opens up. This decision sacrifices immediate tactical opportunities for a more positional game, potentially leading to a strategic battle where black's active pieces can exploit the structural imbalances created. Consider how this exchange influences piece development and future pawn breaks. Doubling pawns on the c-file creates a permanent structural weakness in black's position, but it opens the b-file for your rook and grants a central pawn majority. This trade-off for dynamism requires careful handling. Developing the bishop here targets the kingside and prepares for castling, while also subtly eyeing potential pawn breaks like f4 or g4. Striking at the center with the pawn immediately challenges white's central control and opens up the bishop on c8, aiming to equalize play by creating an active position for black's pieces. Unleashing a swift castle, white tucks the king away safely behind a pawn shield, simultaneously activating the rook towards the now semi-open b-file. This strategic maneuver aims to consolidate white's central pawn structure and prepare for potential kingside pressure, while black must now carefully consider how to address the lingering tension in the center and the newly opened avenues for white's pieces. Developing the knight to its most natural outpost, black prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure and aims to free the bishop currently hemmed in by its own pawns. This move also contributes to controlling important central squares, setting the stage for potential future pawn breaks like d5, which can alleviate positional pressure. Unlocking the queen's potential for central influence and offering support to the beleaguered pawn structure on the queenside becomes the immediate priority, while also preparing to potentially contest the central files and exert pressure on black's less developed kingside. Developing the bishop to b7 aims to prepare its diagonal excursion towards white's kingside, potentially creating pressure on the f2 pawn and the overall white structure, while also reinforcing control of the central dark squares after the pawn exchanges. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to develop the queen's bishop, this quiet maneuver curbs black's ambitious pawn push and seeks to control more squares on the queenside, potentially opening avenues for a kingside attack later on. Anticipating a fight for central influence, black fortifies the d5 pawn and prepares to connect the rooks, aligning the queen with the e-file's potential opening. Developing the bishop to b2 efficiently addresses the pressure on the c-file, simultaneously reinforcing the queenside and offering a clear path for the rook to join the action on that side. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the kingside, allowing for castling and better defense of the f6 knight, while simultaneously preparing to contest the central d-file if white attempts further central expansion. Aggressively seizing open files is a hallmark of aggressive play, and here white initiates a fascinating maneuver to control the a-file. The knight, having sacrificed its central influence on c6, now aims to establish dominance on the queenside, potentially pressuring black's pawn structure and creating dynamic imbalances. This positional gamble seeks to exploit the queenside territory that black has somewhat neglected, hinting at a future strategic battle beyond simple material considerations. Observe how this knight's repositioning might influence the flow of pieces and the potential for pawn breaks in the coming turns. Accepting the pawn sacrifice on e4 immediately opens critical lines for white's pieces and sacrifices a tempo in the process. While it seems to simplify, it grants white's queen and bishop newfound activity along the open diagonals, potentially leading to a queenside initiative if black doesn't react swiftly and precisely. This creates a dynamic imbalance where black needs to prove the positional advantage of the doubled pawns outweighs the immediate material and activity gain for white. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain is a key objective, and capturing on e4 achieves just that, while simultaneously challenging black's doubled pawns. By removing the central pawn, white aims to increase pressure on black's weakened queenside structure. The bishop on e4 now eyes the king's side, potentially contributing to future attacks. This recapture solidifies white's central influence and prepares for further piece development and coordination. The doubled c-pawns for black are now a persistent weakness that white can exploit strategically. Recapturing with the knight immediately disrupts white's central pawn structure and opens the e-file, offering black dynamic counterplay and potentially a safer queen placement. Reclaiming the central pawn opens lines and intensifies the pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, which now boasts isolated doubled pawns on the c and b files. Intensifying the central struggle, black launches a pawn thrust, directly challenging white's control of the d5 square and seeking to open lines for their pieces. This pawn push, while aiming for activity, does create a certain structural imbalance that white will need to consider carefully. Unveiling a direct threat to the castled king, this maneuver initiates a sharp positional battle, aiming to exploit the structural weaknesses black has cultivated. The grand castling initiates a complex battleground on the queen side, introducing immediate threats and counter-threats as both monarchs seek safety, while simultaneously preparing offensive operations against the opposing king. Activating the rook to engage the open d-file asserts immediate pressure, contesting control and preparing for potential pawn pushes or further piece maneuvering into the center. Opening up that central d-file for potential future pressure, black strategically trades off pieces in an effort to simplify the position, perhaps aiming to exploit the lingering weakness on white's queenside pawn structure after the earlier capture on c6 and the subsequent recapture with the b-pawn. The rook exchange finally resolves some of the cluttered central files, aiming to simplify the position and prepare for a potential rook endgame where the pawn structure might become a more significant factor. Regaining the initiative on the d-file, black redirects the rook to a more active position, eyeing potential breakthroughs and challenging white's control. Reclaiming the central file and preparing to leverage the open e-file, this move prioritizes active piece play over passive defense. Solidifying the pawn chain while preparing to contest the central files becomes a priority, though the doubled pawns on the c-file will require careful management throughout the ensuing middle game. The bishop now claims a commanding diagonal, eyeing black's castled king and potentially supporting future pawn advances on the kingside. A fascinating strategic maneuver unfolds as black reroutes the queen, seeking to leverage the newly opened central files and create a potential outpost for the knight on c6, while simultaneously eyeing the d4 pawn and preparing for a potential pawn push with b5. Reinforcing the e4 pawn with f3 while appearing solid creates a subtle pawn island and could potentially hinder the development of the g-pawn later if white seeks a kingside attack, though for now it secures the king's immediate vicinity. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust, black throws down a gauntlet, challenging white's central control and aiming to disrupt the harmony of his pieces. This bold advance, while potentially opening lines, also creates weaknesses, leaving black's king potentially exposed to future assaults. The queen repositions, eyeing the queenside and preparing to potentially exploit the newly opened diagonal. The black king, seemingly tucked away, now faces an approaching storm as pawns begin to surge forward, threatening to rip open its defenses. Safeguarding the king's sanctuary, this maneuver aims to preemptively address the looming threat of black's g-pawn advance, which has significantly encroached upon white's kingside territory. By repositioning the bishop, white seeks to establish a more robust defensive perimeter, creating potential counterplay and discouraging further aggressive pawn pushes that could compromise the king's safety. King's safety, an often overlooked aspect in the heat of battle, is now paramount as the black king, by relocating to d7, seeks a more secure haven away from the immediate storm brewing on the kingside. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, prepares to consolidate forces and potentially activate defensive pieces, a subtle but crucial shift in focus from attacking ambitions to structural integrity. The bishop repositions, seeking active diagonals and preparing to support a potential kingside advance, while simultaneously defending against black's growing central influence and preparing to contest the open files. Shifting the rook to the open file, black prepares to contest the d-file and create potential counterplay against white's somewhat exposed king. Shifting the queen to c3 aims to untangle white's pieces and prepare for potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously adding pressure to black's c-pawn and potentially creating tactical opportunities on the c-file if it opens. Grasping the initiative, black redirects the queen to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially create threats against the kingside. Safeguarding the queen from potential discovered attacks, while repositioning it for central influence, signals a shift towards consolidating white's position. Securing the king behind a pawn shield, while potentially sacrificing some central influence, is a pragmatic step given the open lines and the aggressive positioning of white's queen. This repositioning signals a defensive posture, aiming to consolidate weaknesses before white can fully exploit the exposed king on the dark squares. Unleashing a startling check, white opens a direct assault, exploiting the king's precarious position and the vulnerable dark squares around it after black's ambitious pawn push. The black monarch finds itself in a precarious position, forced to retreat from the immediate threat of the white queen's aggressive sortie, a stark reminder that king's safety can be compromised even deep into the middle game with open files and attacking pieces. A surprising retreat, aiming to sidestep immediate kingside pressure and perhaps reevaluate the initiative, though it surrenders the strong initiative gained by the previous queen's sortie. The king, now a beacon of exposure after a series of daring adventures, finds a temporary refuge here, a stark contrast to the menacing pressure building on the queen's side. Asserting dominion over the central ranks becomes paramount as the rook reclaims its post on the d-file, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's otherwise solid, albeit slightly passive, pawn structure. Activating the bishop to g7 offers a more dynamic defense, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially creating counterplay by challenging white's centralized forces. Suddenly, the seemingly static position explodes into a tactical firefight as the rook on d6 seizes control of the open file, creating immediate pressure. After the stunning exchange sacrificed by white, black has chosen to recapture the bishop, completing the material restoration. This decision acknowledges white's aggressive initiative and aims to stabilize the position. The immediate consequence is a significant shift in the board's energy. The pawn structure, while altered, presents new challenges for both sides. Black must now focus on coordinating their remaining pieces to defend the king, which is still somewhat exposed, and develop a plan to contest the open files that have emerged. White, conversely, will look to exploit any lingering weaknesses and leverage their activated pieces. Capturing the pawn on c5 immediately addresses the hanging material and simplifies the position, though it opens the file for black's rook in the process. Securing the bishop's position and preventing it from being easily harassed by white's remaining pieces is the immediate priority, a subtle defensive maneuver. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, this move sacrifices the rook to rip open the king's defenses and forces a swift end to the game with a cascade of checks. The king's exodus from the center now faces the stark reality of the open files, as the rook's sacrifice has ripped open the defense, leaving it exposed and desperately seeking refuge. Patience is rewarded as the rook, having cleared the path after the queen's sacrifice, now reclaims the central file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create unstoppable mating threats. The bishops retreat to c3, while seemingly passive, attempts to preserve this key defensive piece from further exchanges, aiming to solidify the pawn structure and perhaps find new avenues for activity on the queenside if white commits to aggressive play. Establishing command over the open d-file presents a significant advantage, putting pressure on black's remaining pieces and restricting their movement. Pawn advancement to a5 creates a structural dilemma, aiming to free the bishop, but simultaneously weakening the queenside pawn chain and potentially opening lines for white's rook. Securing the d-file with the rook significantly strengthens white's control over that crucial open line, aiming to squeeze black's king further and potentially prepare for an assault on the queenside pawn structure. The bishop repositions to b4, eyeing the potential for a pawn fork against white's rooks if they were to advance further up the d-file, while simultaneously seeking a more active diagonal than its previous post. Solidifying the central pawn structure aims to gain space and discourage black's potential bishop activity on the b4 square, preparing to activate the remaining rook. Finally, black secures the bishop pair, hoping to leverage it for counterplay. However, this exchange on c5 is a tactical gambit that will grant white significant control over the open d-file and potentially activate their rook on the 7th rank. Reclaiming the bishop allows white to simplify into a more advantageous pawn structure, setting up a potential race on the open files against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Suddenly, the pawn structure crumbles with that audacious capture, revealing a critical weakness around black's king that white can now mercilessly exploit. Sweeping the king into a discovered check with the rook opens lines of attack, aiming to dislodge the troublesome bishop that has found refuge on f3. A desperate attempt to activate the king into the fray, but it walks directly into a potentially devastating discovered attack. Clearing the path forward, this forcing check exploits the precarious placement of black's king, aiming to initiate a decisive exchange sequence that will simplify into a winning material advantage. King's safety now takes center stage as the monarch ventures from its sanctuary, potentially exposing it to the enemy's remaining firepower, forcing black to meticulously calculate every step and consider defensive formations. Pioneering pawn advances now aim to dominate the queenside space, potentially creating a powerful passed pawn to distract black's rook and bishop. That pawn advance on the queenside looks like a desperate attempt to create a distraction, but it leaves that bishop utterly isolated and vulnerable to capture. Initiating pawn expansion on the queenside, a3 aims to secure the queenside structure against potential black incursions and prepare for further pawn advances, potentially opening lines for the rook on the file or supporting a maneuvering knight. Seizing the open file, black initiates a pawn race on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and create a passed pawn of their own. Seizing the open file after the exchange solidifies white's queenside advantage, a crucial positional gain as the game simplifies into an endgame. The pawn's forward push is a desperate gamble to create a passed threat, but it fatally exposes the kingside. Preparing to assert pressure along the file, aiming to activate the rook and potentially create passed pawns on the queenside later. Seizing the open c-file offers a chance to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure and potentially generate counterplay against the advanced pawn. The pawn push on the flank aims to disrupt black's consolidated structure and open up attacking avenues, a bold maneuver in this tense endgame. Squeezing the rook onto the 4th rank after a well-calculated pawn sacrifice offers a temporary reprieve, but the structural weaknesses created earlier in the game, particularly the doubled c-pawns and the isolated pawn, will continue to haunt black as white consolidates. Bringing the king into the fray is a calculated risk, aiming to activate it and potentially support the pawn push on the queenside, but it also exposes it to potential counterplay should black's pieces find favorable squares. The pawn's advance to c4 unlocks potential diagonal aggression for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. reclaiming the open file to prepare for a potential advance of the pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn, is the immediate goal. Unleashing pawns forward like this at the edge of the board, especially with the king's remaining defenders somewhat passive, risks creating isolated weaknesses and overextension, potentially leaving the black king exposed to future pawn pushes and the aggressive pressure from white's remaining pieces. Unleashing a decisive check, the bishop now targets the weakened black king, forcing a retreat that will solidify white's dominant pawn structure. Seeking refuge and a chance to regroup the scattered forces, the king sidesteps the immediate threat and attempts to consolidate around the central pawn mass. Propping up the kingside pawns with g3 looks a bit tentative, a concession to the immense pressure black's bishop exerts, aiming to prevent any immediate king escape via the h-file, but also creating structural weaknesses that might be exploited later. The pawn's march forward creates a dangerous advanced passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially trap the bishop. Unleashing the bishop to its most menacing diagonal, this move seeks to exploit the exposed nature of black's king. A desperate counterthrust, seeking a spark of activity against the encroaching pawn phalanx and white's dominant bishop pair. Sacrificing the rook to simplify into a winning pawn endgame demonstrates a deep understanding of material conversion, prioritizing the active king and pawn majority over maintaining equal material. This pawn's advance, fueled by desperate exchanges, now cleaves open the path for white's monarch, presenting a stark choice between immediate exposure or continued shuffling in a hopeless scenario. The white king awkwardly scrambles towards the center, a desperate attempt to participate in the endgame's inevitable pawn thrusts after that queen sacrifice. The black king, having danced through danger, now finds itself exposed on the e4 square, a tempting target for white's remaining pieces. Gaining a foothold on the crucial dark squares, the bishop now eyes the open files with renewed purpose, aiming to disrupt black's fragile pawn structure and potentially escort its own king to safety through the weakened center. The black king's courageous dash towards the queenside now confronts a formidable white pawn chain, creating a fascinating battleground of exposed diagonals and potential breakthroughs that will decide the fate of this endgame. Unleashing the bishop's power on the long diagonal opens up a vital attacking avenue, aiming to disrupt black's suddenly exposed monarch. The black king, having wandered into a precarious position, now seeks refuge from the encroaching white pieces, aiming to anchor itself behind the pawn chain in anticipation of the inevitable endgame battle that looms. Bringing the bishop to its home on h4 sets up a potential squeeze, aiming to restrict the black king's already limited escape routes and prepare for an eventual pawn push or piece sacrifice to break through. The black king, having ventured far from its defensive fortifications, now finds itself in a perilous position, exposed to potential mating nets and forced exchanges that will lead to a decisive advantage for white. Seeking refuge for the king, this maneuver aims to shepherd the monarch to a safer square amidst the encroaching pawns and potential threats. Pushing the h-pawn here creates a crucial escape square for the black king, a vital defensive maneuver when facing the relentless white attacking formation. Unleashing the bishop to h4 aims to exploit the now exposed black king, potentially setting up a mating net or winning material through tactical threats. Promoting a queen is the obvious move, but it's worth considering the potential pitfalls of allowing the opponent to activate their remaining pieces so quickly. King now exposed to the elements after that capture, white must immediately consider king's safety and coordination. Black's king, having survived a perilous journey, now finds itself in an astonishingly safe position thanks to the opportune promotion to a queen and the subsequent capture of white's bishop. Unleashing a forcing check, white aims to disrupt black's king consolidation and exploit the lingering threats on the d-file and the open diagonals. The king's desperate scramble for survival is nearing its inevitable conclusion, as the monarch is cornered into a position of extreme vulnerability. The bishop repositions to d8, a quiet but crucial regrouping, aiming to bolster the g7 pawn from any potential knight incursions and to prepare for a potential advance of the f-pawn, creating a fortress-like structure for the king while black's rook on e2 is currently a tempting, but ultimately isolated target. The pawn push to g3 fundamentally alters the king's sanctuary, creating a critical weakness that can be exploited to expose the monarch's precarious position. Pawn's relentless march begins, aiming to secure the queen and disrupt black's precarious king. The bishop captures the pawn, offering white a chance to create a decisive passed pawn on the file by advancing the pawn currently on a6. Black must now be extremely vigilant about white's remaining queen and rook if the bishop sacrifice is accepted. The bishop hops onto e7, subtly reinforcing the pawn chain's advance and creating a potential outpost for the knight should it return to the action. Unleashing the king's knightly potential now, aiming to exploit the newly opened g-file for a decisive assault. Stepping the bishop back to d8 aims to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the king side, while also keeping an eye on any sneaky checks black might try to orchestrate. The pawn's lonely march towards promotion on the queen side opens a new avenue of counterplay, but it also exposes its own king further to the relentless pressure of the white bishop. The knight bravely ventures to a central outpost, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to harass black's advancing king's guard. Pushing the h-pawn now is a desperate gamble to distract white's king and potentially create a passed pawn, but the g-pawn is too far advanced, and the white king is too safe behind its pawns for this to be truly threatening. It's more of a last-ditch effort to complicate the position.